questions. We won't ask her about her personal carbon footprint resulting from this research.
Yeah, I've seen Chaz give that talk a few times, and then the hypocrisy thesis the first time, but it never makes me sleep well at night. And I just to say that this is a nice kind of setup. I think Lisa and John, your comments are going to be somewhat relevant, although at a very different scale than what I'll be talking about. And one of the interesting issues of being an environmental researcher is that you have to kind of address these really thorny problems, and you find yourself in the situation where you're arguing against transparency, right? And that's a little odd, but on some level important. And I'm going to be arguing to some degree against social capital, which is, again, that's kind of an odd scenario. But I think it brings out a lot of the really intriguing questions about human nature and sort of what can foster solutions to some of these grand problems. So I'll be talking to you today about an ongoing project. There's 2 papers that are under review right now, but I'm actively analyzing these data. So I hope that questions, comments, reactions would be super helpful at this point in time. The sort of overall framing of the work that I've been doing in this area, we're going to a different part of the world. We're going to Sri Lanka. We're talking about smallholding farmers and how smallholding farmers are making decisions to respond to these big pressing environmental challenges. We've got a basic issue of food supply in the world right now. I mean, there's estimates right now that suggest we need something on the order of a doubling of food production by 2050 simply to keep pace with rising demand of a larger population, and a population that's better fed than it ever has been before, which we want them, of course, to be better fed. That's not considering the impacts of climate change. Once you start bringing in climate models, the situation becomes far more daunting. We've got areas drying out, dry areas are getting drier, wet areas are getting wetter. We've seen nearly a doubling of areas classified as very dry since the 70s. Something now on the order of 80% of the global population is vulnerable to water scarcity. So these are really big issues, and there's significant questions about how we're going to feed a world of 9 billion in the next century when we consider both the sort of just existing challenges in the system, but also the climate disruptions that may be emerging. So I'm talking about I'm sort of looking in at this particular farmer, these smallholding agriculturists that are at the center of this very complex situation and trying to understand how they're making decisions. And in the Sri Lankan context, which is similar to a lot of other monsoonal environmental contexts, there are a lot of things that farmers can do to try to adapt to some of these environmental challenges. I'm speaking specifically about water scarcity in this project, but some of these kind of responses can be used both to adapt to flooding, pests, other kinds of environmental disruptions. Just to give you a little bit of the flavor of the kind of things I'm talking about. I mean, farmers have choices about the seed variety that they select. In Sri Lanka, there's a wide use of what are called short duration seed varieties. They're hybrids. They've been developed to reduce the growing season so you can get a harvest quicker, which means your crop is less vulnerable to water irrigation disruptions, pest disruptions, elephants trampling through fields, flooding if the case may be. It can improve yields in environmentally challenging seasons. There are ways of actually cultivating the crop itself. You can establish a crop in a nursery. It can make a more resilient crop once it's transplanted to the larger fields, or diversification. Ben, who's a student I've been working with, is going to be looking at diversification in this context in the coming year. So there are ways that farmers can respond to these challenges, but what I see in the research that I've been doing in this area is that these kinds of techniques are consistently underutilized. There's relatively low adoption, even in particular contexts and seasons where farmers could benefit pretty tremendously from using these kinds of strategies. So this is just showing you a large sample, the largest sample I have from these data of 1,200 farmers. I mean, the techniques I just described to you are well known, well understood. A lot of them have been adopted over the course of the farmer's life, but in these particularly water-scarce seasons, we see really low rates of adoption. These are the seasons when farmers could benefit most from these strategies. So you see at best, less than 20% adoption of a hybrid rice variety, which is a pretty good bet in a water-scarce season for improving your yields. So what explains this adoption gap? This is the sort of basic fundamental question that I've been trying to look at in the research I've been sort of focusing on in the last couple of years. And so today I want to tell you a little about one particular line of analyses I've been doing, which is to try to understand how the farmer's embeddedness in a social environment in the community with other farmers in their village and neighboring villages, how that relates to the farmer's response to water scarcity, cultivation strategies, and in this particular analysis, resilience to a pretty significant drought that occurred back in 2014. So as I said, these are 2 papers under review, and we're sort of working through this larger data set, so very much a work in progress. So now let me turn and talk a little bit about this sort of issue of social capital. Social integration is the kind of word I'm trying to use in this analysis, because I will be measuring this at the level of the individual. How integrated is the individual in the community? Are they participating in social groups? Do they trust others in the community? You see a lot of discussion within the social sciences, a sort of fascination with this idea of social capital. I like this definition the best. There are a lot out there, but this idea of there being really dense, rich social networks where people can access opportunities to collaborate, to coordinate, to exchange information, to rely on one another in the case of there being some sort of shock, environmental economic shock. There's a large literature suggesting that these things are important. Psychologists, those of us who are psychologists, of course, human connection is a basic fundamental kind of need and thing that fosters well-being. And so, we see this precedence, and it's beginning, well, not beginning, I should say, but there's a growing attention to the role of social capital within the adaptation literature, and I would say a real kind of fixation on the idea of social capital. The idea that this is a pathway by which farmers can collaboratively deal with these kinds of environmental stressors. A lot of the resources that are utilized in especially small-scale agricultural environments are collective resources, and they need to be collaboratively managed. There's no way to allocate water out of a reservoir without having some level of coordination over the timing, the length of the season, the number of water releases, and so on and so forth. And so a number of scholars have rightfully pointed out that social capital is a real source of resilience to deal with the kinds of environmental shocks that we're anticipating in a warming climate. Lynn Ostrom's work, of course, talks about social capital as being a way to foster social norms that can govern and collectively manage resources. I've seen in my own data that social trust is an important factor that facilitates intentions to adopt certain kinds of climate resilient agricultural strategies. So it's important, right? It's important and it should deserve attention. But what I've seen, I think, a neglect of in this literature, and that's sort of inspired some of this work, is that all of those analyses and a lot of the literature is not asking the basic question about who is actually benefiting from these social capital arrangements. Who are the beneficiaries? Who is it serving? And how are the costs and benefits of adaptation distributed across diverse members of a community? There has been some discussion. I mean, even in Ostrom's sort of early work, when she was laying out this sort of theory of governance, argued that there could be a dark side, a perverse side to the social capital that needs to be thought about and considered as we're thinking about institutional arrangements for natural resource management. Strong social commitments can undermine flexibility and innovation. We may feel obliged to behave in a certain way to our community, to other individuals that we're interdependent with. And to some degree, maybe that can stymie innovation. And innovation is likely going to be necessary part of adapting agriculture to climate change. What else I want to focus on today is, can it introduce and exacerbate inequalities? Who is powerful within the system and who is able to make the sort of rules of the game? And to what extent are other more vulnerable groups beholden to a set of rules that may not be working to their favor? And to what extent do we need to be thinking about that and adding that to our list of considerations as we think about adaptation policy and planning? So that's kind of the focus of this analysis. So quickly, let me just orient you a little bit to this particular decision-making context that I've been studying in Sri Lanka. I mean, we're talking about smallholding agriculturalists. This is a very traditional village kind of setup. Most of the villages now, the village is sort of situated over here. You've got the paddy fields, which is the primary crop in the region, sort of next to the village, below the reservoir. In a lot of communities, the reservoirs are now outside of the village. They're much larger and they're managed with central government involvement. But nonetheless, the basic idea here is the same, is that you've got farmers that have different fields throughout this command area, and the kinds of strategies to adapt to a drought event or a flooding event, or even in a normal season, are different for a farmer who's sort of sitting at the bottom of this command area compared to at the top where the water is sort of feeding into the fields. So this guy who's down here may prefer a shorter duration seed variety because he or she may have less access to this water. The water may dry out before it gets to the bottom of the field. The quality might be lower. These guys might have problems with waterlogging, so they prefer a different kind of irrigation schedule. So everyone in this sort of system, while they're reliant on this one particular water supply and engaged in collaboratively managing that water supply, they have different needs in how that water supply is managed, and they have different cost-benefit sort of distributions and how the outcomes of those decisions. So we have the situation that the rules are set collaboratively. We have to decide when that water starts to get released, how long across the season it's going to be released, at what schedule it will be released. And there's a lot of collaboration I found as well from the qualitative work that we've done in sort of dictating a set of rules even outside of that water. Even the particular rice seed that's chosen to be cultivated is managed and decided on at a higher level by the farm organization or a community of farmers together decide, okay, even given the length of time water is released, we're going to plant this particular seed and we're going to cultivate it in this particular way. And that is done very collaboratively. So if you have a lot of influence on setting those kinds of rules, conforming to those rules is good for you, right? That's likely to be aligned with what you want and is likely to produce higher yields because the rules are sort of designed in your favor. But what about those people that are a little bit less influential, have less power in the system, where the rules may not be set for their favor. They didn't have as much influence on dictating the rules of the game. And so they have a tough decision to make. Do I conform to the rules that were established and risk these lower yields, risk the inability to adapt to this particular drought, or do I choose not to conform, gamble the sort of good social harmony that I'm trying to maintain within this community at the benefit potentially of having higher yields or a better sort of ability to respond in any kind of environmental shock sort of environment. So the question is, are there some trade-offs being made between agricultural resilience and outcomes, adapting to climate change, and social harmony, particularly for people in these marginalized groups? We've been looking at social capital and social integration primarily from the perspectives of the mainstream, but I want to try to disaggregate that data a little bit and think about these individuals that are a little less powerful within the community. So this is one of the papers and was done by graduate student Ariel Tozier. I'm not going to go into much detail about this, but a lot of her qualitative work revealed the sort of level, the high degree of coordination, how these decisions are made, how collaborative they are, and sort of revealed that there might be some sort of inequalities in this system that should be given further consideration. But okay, let's talk for a second about powerful groups. Okay, so where are a lot of these decisions made? Where are the negotiations taking place about the water release schedules and the length of the cultivation season and the planting and harvesting dates? They're made in rooms like this. This is a regional farmer organization meeting. Do you notice something obvious about the constellation of people here? They're all dudes. They all are, 80 to 90% of farmers in Sri Lanka, those that are sort of designated the head farmer in the household are male. It's a very male-dominated profession. If you talked more to the people in this room, you'd also notice that they're all landed. They all are primarily landowners, and they tend to be wealthier. They tend to be wealthier members of the community, longer-standing individuals that have a lot of sort of political power to sort of influence these decisions. Who is missing? The poor, the landless, women farmers. So how are they benefiting or not from the kind of collective management systems that we are seeing in this place? So here's the data, quick snapshot, and I'm happy to elaborate on the data. This is data from a study that I've been involved in called the Sri Lankan Environmental and Agricultural Decision-Making Survey. We've just wrapped up data collection. All these data, it's an NSF-funded study. All these data are going to be publicly available by January, so if you're interested in adaptation in agriculture, I encourage you to kind of check it out. This analysis is based on a subsample of this data, which was collected in 2014. We interviewed a little less than 300 rice farmers at their homes in Sri Lanka. We talked to them both at the beginning, at the planting stage of the primary rice growing season in the country, collected extensive information about the socioeconomic conditions, how they're managing their farms, historical sort of yields and decision-making patterns, demographics about the household. And then we came back to them at the end of the season and collected some a shorter survey instrument where we asked about their yields for that particular season, how they manage their crop, the kinds of outcomes that they experience, those kinds of things. The dependent variable I'll be looking at in this particular analysis is paddy yield, which is the primary crop that's grown and really the major livelihood source and economic sort of revenue strategy for these farmers. And as I mentioned, I'll be looking at groups of women-headed farms, farmers who are renters that don't own their own land, and farmers that are below the 20th percentile in terms of their economic wealth within the community. Now between our baseline and our follow-up data points, these 2 time points, there was a really significant drought that occurred in Sri Lanka at this time. This is 2014, the monsoon that brings 80% of the precipitation in the country was well below average. There was a near failure of the monsoon in some areas, and so you saw pretty significant impacts in the region of the country that I was working in. Something like a third of farmers lost their crops. There was significant increases in food insecurity, and so we have pretty significant impacts in this area, and that's sort of the backdrop against which this data was collected. So this issue of social integration, or kind of talking a little bit in tandem with social capital, I measured it in this study in 2 ways. We have one measure which I'm calling social trust, which is the extent to which the farmer perceives that others in the community are trustworthy, that there's harmony, that we're close with one another. It's based on 3 items. And then the second measure, which reflects more formal participations in agricultural institutions, is the farmer attending farmer organization meetings. Are they engaged in these sort of agricultural labor sharing agreements? Arrangements? Sharing farm equipment, sharing labor, and engage in some of the decision making regarding agriculture. Okay, so here's the basic model. I'm going to zoom in on a few effects, but just to kind of orient you to what I'm doing here. So we've got farmers in 6 communities. I'm controlling for a community. We're looking at a lot of different control variables. So I'm controlling for age, level of education, the size of the land that they have, whether it's rented or owned, historical issues with water insecurity, and then historical typical yield. So we know if this farmer's land is typically productive or not, even though we're modeling their yield that they obtained in the last season. Then I've got our 3 measures, our 3 variables which represent marginalized group status, and the 2 social integration variables. But what I really want to look at is the interaction between marginalized group status and these 2 social integration variables. And so, okay, so that's just the effects. But let me just show you visually what we see here. Okay, so what is the relationship between, this should say social trust and yields. So if you're a male farmer, which I'm plotting here in gray, there is no relationship. You can be completely alienated or completely embedded within your community, have really good relationships, and it doesn't matter for your yields. But if you're a female farmer, it matters pretty dramatically. If you're a female farmer and you're less sort of trustworthy or less engaged in the community, you tend to actually perform better. Your yields are much higher than if you have very high levels of social trust and social engagement and sort of closeness with the community. You have a cost. There's a penalty of social engagement for female farmers. What's going on here? Let's look at land ownership. Very similar pattern. If you own land, it doesn't matter. You've got some, in my opinion, my interpretation is you've got some say in decision making. You have some political power. You could be a person that nobody likes, or you could be the most popular guy in town, and it doesn't matter for your yields. If you're landless, however, you perform much better if you're less engaged, and much worse if you're heavily engaged and tied closely to the community. This does not replicate for our group of poor farmers. Now, we tend to see that poor farmers underperform relative to wealthy farmers during a drought season. Their yields are lower, gray line here. So droughts impacts are more severe for poor farmers, but there doesn't seem to be an interaction with this social trust variable. There is a sort of a different pattern for institutional participation, and that's only for women. So the only effect I see this with is for this gender social institutional participation variable. Here we see that for males, this is a slightly negative sloping effect. It's not significant. So for males, it doesn't really matter whether you're participating formally in these institutions. But for females, there is a significant benefit for being part of these formal institutions. If you're not a part of them, you're particularly penalized. If you aren't a part of them, there seems to be some sort of pathway here to achieve higher yields. 5 minutes. So there's like sort of 2 different routes of engaging in the community, right? There's these formal routes that seem to have special benefits for women, and then there are these informal routes, these softer forms of social engagement that seem to be particularly challenging or relate to sort of an underperformance for women. All right, so I'm sorry, as I said, there's no other interaction effects. So what's kind of explains this? My interpretation here is that we've got the situation where marginalized farmers have to make a difficult trade-off between maintaining community harmony whereby they follow rules that are not designed for them and are not working in their favor, or they have to buck the system, risk losing some friends in the process, but they may be able to adapt and respond more effectively to the environmental challenges they're facing. It's different for engagement in formal channels. Women really benefit from that. They benefit from having access to these formal organizations and formal decision-making strategies. I interpret this as that guys are doing this a lot, right? They're hanging out at the tea shop and they're talking to each other offline, and they're doing it in the bars like John mentioned, the happy hours. Women don't have access to those kind of channels as much. They have to rely on these more formal channels of participation. And I think this might explain why you see this particular benefit for women who are involved in these formal institutions. So and then finally, one of the things that emerge, especially out of the qualitative work, is in our discussions with farmers about innovation, about doing things differently, about planting a different crop or planting a different seed variety, is that there's a real risk of going against the tide within your community. There's a real risk of fraying from the norms. There's a sense that if something goes wrong for anyone in the community, if I'm the one that innovated or did something different, I would be the one to be blamed. And that level of concern and sort of adherence to the norms in your community, I'm sure helps a lot when you're coordinating water allocation in typical seasons. But when we're thinking about having to dramatically change the way we do agriculture in communities around the world, to what extent is it suppressing innovation? To what extent is it making it more and more challenging for farmers to experiment, to try new things, to diversify their strategies for cultivating? And to what extent do we need to be thinking about ways to sort of, in some level, circumvent or sort of reorient social capital or these social networks in a way that can allow some opportunity for farmers to sort of respond and manage their crops in somewhat different ways. So that's what I've got to say. We have time for questions?
Yeah, you have time for questions.
Yeah.
Thanks, Amanda. That was great. So I wonder, to what extent is this a story about social capital? And to me, as a political scientist, of course I'm biased in that direction, but it seems to me that these decisions are political decisions, and there's a lot of political domination, power relationships. So is it really about perhaps a combination of those things, or?
Yeah. So you're saying is this an artifact of just political decision making rather than social capital per se? Is the question? Yeah, it's a good question, and I've been thinking about that as well. I think I attribute it more towards, or at least being connected in with social capital, that there's something about the density and strength of these networks and norms that are associated with them that may be inhibiting innovation and diversification within the community, more from the qualitative work than the quantitative work I just described to you. So I kind of glossed over that, but we see that come out pretty strongly in the qualitative discussions about the reasons farmers give us for, why did you choose to plant rice that season? You would have done so much better if you had planted, onion or chili or something. And there are, sometimes there are structural reasons, but other times it's sort of a concern that this is a village that plants rice. That's what we do, and why would I go against that sort of that norm?
Just to follow up on that, so if it had been a more, democratic or inclusive decision-making process when these choices are made, and there had been these strong networks, would you expect a different effect of having more trust or stronger community connections? So I guess I'm just questioning whether this focus on social capital per se,
right,
without considering the political characteristics of the decision making.
Right. It's a fair question. I would wonder why you see this social engagement effect, though. I mean, right now it seems to be part and parcel of political decision making, but perhaps you could disconnect those two things. If there was a more inclusive decision making, then the kind of potential penalizing effect of wanting to sort of support and harmonize with your community may not be a trade-off anymore. So, it's connected, but perhaps that's sort of a way around the issue, and I think that's a good point. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.